Hello, everyone, and welcome to WhiteSource's webinar. My name is Victoria Oikninen, and I'll be moderating today's session. Here with us is Sharon Sharlin, Product Marketing Manager at WhiteSource, who will be presenting to you the top 5 things you need to know about open source security. For those of you who have not joined us in our previous webinars, I'd just like to shortly go over a few housekeeping items so you'll know how to participate in today's session. During Sharon's presentation, you'll be able to submit questions through the webinar platform. These will then be addressed at the end of the webinar during our dedicated Q&A session. In addition, please note we are recording the webinar, which we will be sending out to all attendees and registrants at the end of the session. That's it from me for now, Sharon. I'd like to hand over to you.
Thank you, Victoria. Hello, everyone. My name is Sharon Sharlin. I'm Product Marketing Manager in WhiteSource, and I'm very happy to be here today. Even happier because we're using a webinar as a platform, and we're not doing a physical seminar, a face-to-face type of seminar, because then we'll probably have to cancel, right? Crazy Corona days. So I offer you a break today from the coronavirus discussion. Let's have a ride and talk the open source security risks. 5 things you need to know. We'll talk about the fact that open source risk is rising, and we see how we probably need to better change our mindset. We'll see some graph, trend, statistics. We'll talk about prioritization of security vulnerabilities. There really no right or wrong answer about how to do it. It's just a matter of what is your business is all about and what your product is related to. So we will cover a few prioritization options. We see how we can delegate security responsibilities. So no more one person or group carry the burden of security. We delegate responsibility and we give the right tools and training in order to do it. And we see how we're shifting left security and all the values that are coming together with it. So without further ado, let's start with a quick overview of the security market. We see in the diagram the different pillars of risk versus investment, while the endpoints, data, and server pillars are roughly aligned. We see that the application and the network pillars are posing anomalies. Let's start with the application. AppSec is becoming more challenging and complex as release frequency continues to rise, and the requirements for data security are getting more strict. Thanks to new DevOps practice and tools, the development cycles are getting shorter, allowing organizations to meet the market demands and to deliver better customer experience. Now, application security has gone through a transition recently when information security teams that used to test products before release, before production, became less relevant. Today, developers start taking part as leading role in the day-to-day over commercial responsibility. They are the one making the first few steps assessing security. The AppSec risk column is very high. It's getting bigger because nowadays every organization that wants to move to the cloud needs to write its application from scratch, or at least several components, or at least amend it to move to the cloud. So in a scenario that the application is moving to the cloud, we face unproportional security growth because we're not using the same infrastructure anymore, we're not using the same protocols anymore. So it makes a lot of sense. Now let's look at the network column. The investment column in the network pillar is very high. And this is because I think historical reasons. The hardware manufacturer were the one producing the network products. And network security was always fixed tightly to it, as it was very obvious to everyone that whoever penetrates the network get it all. In addition to that, a big part of network is also moving to the cloud. And in the cloud, there are ample of security investment helping application to move to the cloud. So the network investment grows again. It kind of doubles. So with all those forces and changes in the world, let's see how do we write application today. In the past, it used to be all about proprietary code. Nowadays, it's all about open source. Open source components account for 60 to 80% in average. I think that we are all aware of the trend of the growth, but looking at the actual numbers in 2 decades, we got ramped up from 10% to 80%. And it really strengthened the trend. It's explained how obvious it is. So WhiteSource conducted a survey among 700 developers from the US, from Europe, and we asked them, what are the challenges and practice that you face with open source usage? And we got amazing results. 97% of the answers that we got say that they are using open source one way or another, like all the time, very often, sometimes. And only a minor percent of developers, like 3.2%, don't use open source component at all. And if I had to guess, I would say that it is because of company policies and nothing else. In addition to this very interesting and unequivocal survey results, we see all the big forces, all the big companies in the market shifting, investing, acquiring, making sure they have all the right growth engines. Microsoft bought GitHub, IBM bought Red Hat, Google holds huge open source projects like Kubernetes, like TensorFlow. And in fact, open source is so successful and acknowledged that it started to influence the way proprietary code is being written and shared. So the name is inner source, and it's a new way of sharing code from within the organization. Big companies look at the value they get from open source and enforce the open source methodologies into their organization. I love it. I like this phenomenon. Seeing that open source is influencing back on the way proprietary code is being written and shared is great. So we discussed the growth of open source and the big amount of open source out of the general code. And here we see that the number of reported vulnerability is rising. So the number of reported vulnerability are indeed rising, but it doesn't necessarily imply that open source components are getting less secure or trustworthy. On the contrary, I think the greater focus there is on open source and greater usage of open source components, and more eyeballs are on the code looking for vulnerabilities and looking for ways to address and remediate them. So this trend indeed suggests that open source vulnerability is rising, but also suggests that constant usage and trust the community has in open source is also rising. Now I want to be a bit cynical and say that because we are all looking for ways to be efficient and to save time, and we simply dislike inventing the wheel over and over again, we will continue and embrace open source in spite of the vulnerability it brings, because it also brings the remediation. This is the nice thing about open source. You get alerts about vulnerabilities, but you also get the fix. The community alert and provide also the fixes. And this is great. Now, I want to discuss the difference between open source vulnerabilities and between proprietary vulnerabilities. Because there are differences that require different attention. When we're looking at proprietary code vulnerability in compared to open source vulnerability, we see different detection methods. For proprietary code, we detect for potential vulnerability, and we use tools like SAST, static application security testing, that are also considered as white box testing, considered to be very comprehensive, but also bring high volume of false positive. And another tool is DAST, stands for Dynamic Application Security Testing, aka black box testing, and it detects runtime vulnerabilities, which is less comprehensive. And those two, SAST and DAST, are really going together. With open source scanning, the vulnerabilities are known and open to the public. And this is, by the way, what makes them very dangerous. As developers, community doesn't contain only white hats like Angel. The information is also open to the bad guys out there, and we need to bear it in mind. And lastly, scanning phase. Open source vulnerability can be discovered even years after a component has been released to the market. Therefore, we need to continue and monitor. We can't afford just to have the scanning one time or one period. Like an example, Heartbeat vulnerability was found years after the flawed OpenSSL was released. The good news about open source vulnerabilities is that 90% of them have fixes. So again, the community alerts, fix, and release updates. So you need to stay alert and hear the news. In the same research among those 700 developers, we also asked, how do you handle security issues? And the answer was, first we detect the actual vulnerability. Later, we prioritize, and finally, we remediate. Currently, developers spend 15 hours per month per developer on security vulnerabilities, including prioritization, including approval, back and forth emails, and only 4 hours on the actual remediation. So let's see how do we prioritize, because there are many different ways to do it. So first way to prioritize can be based on the severity of the vulnerability. High, medium, low, and it resembles the risk for the core of the application, the potential damage. A second way to prioritize can be how easy or difficult it is to fix it. Like if we want to shrink down the vulnerability list, we need to focus on the ones that are easy to fix, not very politically correct. I don't know any company that informal allowed developers to do it, but it resembles a way. And another way to prioritize can be according to the date when it was first disclosed. The older it is, the more chances are that it will be exploited, more dangerous. Another way to prioritize is according to the impact of the business, the impact to the environment, like if it involves customer data, if it involves intellectual property, if it involves specific personnel. And last but not least, there's a way to prioritize according to effective or non-effective vulnerability. And this will lead me to the next slide, where I'm going to explain how we define effective vulnerability. So when we're writing code, the proprietary code can call different libraries, and those libraries may or may not contain vulnerabilities. When our proprietary code is making a call to a vulnerable function inside a library, then we treat it as effective vulnerability. When the proprietary code is not making a call to the vulnerable component inside the library, then it's a non-effective vulnerability. And since there are many components in a library, we should only look for a specific vulnerable method inside that our code is calling to. So after testing 2,000 Java applications, WhiteSource found that 85% of all detected vulnerabilities were actually non-effective. It's a huge amount of time that we can save by approaching all the effective vulnerability and free our time to daily projects. If we remember 2 slides back, we saw that on average, developers spend around 15 hours per developer per month. Then we can actually bring back 12 hours to a daily project, and that's a lot. Also, by assessing the effective vulnerability, we dramatically reduce risk. As not always we get to solve all vulnerabilities, or at least not solve them on time, politically correct saying. And may I remind that open source vulnerabilities are out in the open. Then every minute that we spend or not sorting the effective vulnerability, we are actually posing a risk. Even if we chose a different method of prioritization that accidentally left the effective vulnerability to the end, then we probably chose a very risk way to do prioritization, because the entire time that we were dealing in other things, the actual danger vulnerabilities were still there. So bridging the gap is a must. Yes, it's a must, and let's see how we can do it with security, DevOps, and developers, 3 groups that are coming from 3 different disciplines. Developer and operations are closer one to another. They are getting measured by similar parameters like time sprints, product release, while security is getting measured by a complete different set of parameters, security-related parameters. Hence, they tend to push and pull to different directions, and this phenomenon is making a lot of sense. Lately, we see that those disciplines, the gaps between them, narrows down in baby steps. Security is being spread slowly into the regular routine of the developers. In addition, developers are being empowered, possessing more knowledge, training, and tools in order to actually amend security vulnerabilities. Embedding security into developers and DevOps is what we call DevSecOps, and it's fundamentally related to 3 things. First one is the integration of security aspects and practices into DevOps. Second, agile. Use agile methodologies and deliver small pieces of code in frequent release. And last, automation. Automate whenever possible. We don't want to send people to do machine-capable job. After realizing that security must become part of the development lifecycle, it's important now to determine what will be the best stage to integrate it. So instead of waiting with security checks to the end of the SDLC and suffer from complexity, inefficiency, bottlenecks, we push automation, awareness, and responsibility into the first few stages of the development. By doing so, we're providing developers with faster and automatic way to remediate those security vulnerabilities. Now, developers with the right tools, with the right training, with the right knowledge, will actually turn to be security advocates and gatekeepers to security in a positive way. The slide here is actually showing what's going on in reality. If in the previous slide I was talking about shifting left, it was more of shifting left in a PowerPoint diagram, and it's easy, right? But this slide showing reality is showing the adoption of security shift left model. So in the past, responsibility for security of the application was traditionally in hands of company security professionals. Developers used to design, build a product, and then security experts would perform their tests, their reviews, and flag for issues that requires remediation. So everyone pretty much knew what the role was all about and contained. However, these days those lines are not clear anymore. The boundaries are getting shifts, and those lines are now blurred. What we see is clear movement of ownership. Around 70% of the respondents stated that ownership lies in the software development side. And it doesn't matter if it's DevOps, developers, team leaders on software development teams, but still development side. While only around 30%, what we see 25, 30, 31%, think that the security is still in the hands of security team. And if I may say that those numbers are also a bit misleading, I think, because when you ask someone who's in charge of security and one of the answers is security team, then this is the natural ad hoc reply. But if you ask someone who's in charge of remediating vulnerabilities, then maybe the answers were even higher in favor of developers. I don't know, it's just a guess. We can also see that the smaller organization is, the shift left phenomenon is adopted faster, and more developers are doing security type of work, and this explains the little gap between the 31% to the 25% when the organization is smaller. The impact of developers taking over security is integrating security tool earlier in the SDLC. So in contrast of the waterfall methodology that we used in the past, security was only reviewed before the release and sent back. Security issues for a developer to investigate. Today, modern DevOps relies on testing for vulnerabilities early and often, trying to avoid the time-wasting bottlenecks before release. So we see that 66% of developers are taking action towards application testing on build stage or before. And I look at the 36% of organizations that are trying to integrate security testing tools at earlier points in the SDLC, like the IDE, repositories. This even emphasized the phenomena stronger. No real difference was found between SMB, SME, and enterprise. We did find a strong correlation between companies where developers rely heavily on open source components and companies that test their application before the build. And it's not much of a surprise, as both are characteristic of mature DevOps organizations. So we talked about efficiency, we talked about developers' empowerment, we talked about avoiding bottlenecks. And if you need extra motivation for embracing security as early as possible, now it's money time. Just look at those numbers. They talk for themselves. The difference between $80 vulnerability fixed cost in coding stage blows up to $7,600 in production stage. Sorry. The gap is huge. It's nearly 100 times higher. So we shift left and start tackling security issue from coding and building rather than assessing security in production or right before that. And shifting left is also shifting the mindset. And by providing developers more tools, more training, more knowledge, we can resolve problems when they face them as early as browsing for code. Yes, tools like that exist in the market. You can find vulnerabilities starting from browsing for code. Today, there are plugins, integration that allows developers to get information of open source components and risk issues inside the IDE. So really no effort. Everything is in your regular environment. And the motivation is huge. We see 3 top values of adopting shift left. First is time saving. With the move to DevSecOps and having security part of the development cycle, vulnerabilities are detected and remediated much faster. Second is cost reduction. We saw in the previous slide that nearly 100 times different was before tackling vulnerability in coding stage or tackling vulnerability in production stage. And last is quality, secure by design. When security is becoming an integral part of the development, together with the introduction of automation and tools, quality is much better. So, to summarize, the way to develop code is changing. And open source is everywhere. With open source come the open source vulnerabilities that are rising and requires different methods and tools to tackle them. And those tools and methods necessary different from the proprietary code methods and tools, as we saw. DevOps and security are becoming one. Streamlined DevSecOps actually allows the security shift left method. And the potential of introducing the shift left method brings better quality, cost saving, and time saving. All those goodies. And with this, I'll thank you very much for your time and open the floor to questions. It's Q&A time.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for the presentation, Sharon. So, as you said, we've reached the Q&A session. And I'm happy to see we have quite a few questions from the audience, so let's get right to it. Sharon, first question. How can I improve my vulnerability prioritization?
All right. Then, as we saw, there are different ways to prioritize vulnerabilities. And there is no right or wrong how to prioritize and how to tackle vulnerabilities. It's mainly according to your audience, the way you're building your code and your products. And you need to think whether your application is touching customer data, whether you have intellectual property. Those kind of things can give you an idea about what to solve first. Another way to prioritize is according to the vulnerable, effective or non-effective method. We touched it just a little bit, but I want to emphasize how big the value of prioritizing according to that. Assuming that we have high severity vulnerability. Then if we would prioritize according to severity, we would probably tackle this vulnerability first. But if we have a way to prioritize according to effective or non-effective vulnerability, then we would have known that there is no actual route between our proprietary code and this vulnerable method. So in spite of the fact that I have vulnerability in high severity in the library, I'm not touching it. I'm not calling this method. And I'm actually not in danger, because in runtime, we're not going to call it, and it won't pose any danger to the application. So while I'm trying to remediate this high severity vulnerability, I'm kind of losing time to tackle other vulnerabilities that are effective to my application, that my proprietary code are calling to. So yeah, it kind of gives few ideas about how to prioritize. We also covered other ways during the presentation. I hope it answered the question.
Okay, next question. What's the best way to remediate vulnerabilities? Are there any specific tools for that that you recommend?
Yes, indeed. Developers it's not a matter of being lazy, it's a matter of being productive. We don't want to do manual type of work with updating or upgrading things that we can get automatically, right? So already today, there are several tools out there in the market that can automatically suggest pull requests. The only thing you need to do is to accept the changes, and you can be sure that you're not breaking the code. So I'm always in favor of automation. Automatic tools are great, and they're really ease our day. So this is my 20 cents about that.
Okay, last question. What tools are available to train developers to incorporate security into the development process?
It's already happening. Like, we're already giving developers responsibility of remediation, remediating vulnerabilities. But in addition to the responsibility, we need to make sure that our bring developers team with the right training and knowledge to do that, and the right tools. Having the responsibility as a standalone will not help. So if we are aware of this phenomena and what's happening with the DevSecOps, then we need to make sure that the developers are trained and have the right knowledge and also the right tools in place. The moment they will start doing that, they will also be happy and proud with the results, and they will acknowledge the success.
Perfect. And that is basically a wrap-up of today's session. Sharon, thank you so much for today's presentation. I'd also like to say thank you to everyone who has attended today's session and watched our webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the WhiteSource team. And with that, I'll say goodbye and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.